There are two things that I think broadly, no, maybe three things that don't work. Firstly is our preoccupation with homelessness. Now, clearly, homelessness is a humanitarian tragedy. It's also actually an economic tragedy because a lot of people that are homeless are young people. So we're not investing in them. They're excluded from work. Their lives are precarious. You know, if you want to have people really engaged in your society, you don't allow them to become homeless. So I'm not saying that homelessness is not important, but it is only a symptom, and it's a symptom of a failed system. So you keep on pouring money, resource, anxiety into homelessness, counting it, setting up sort of small programs, constantly trying to wrap services around homeless people, many of whom actually don't need wraparound services. They just need a home. So I think that's one thing that doesn't work, because homelessness is just a reaction to a symptom, and we need to change the system. The second thing that it doesn't work is just keeping on going down this pathway which says New Zealand, like other societies, UK in particular would be identified in this, and sort of saying we've got this addiction to a owner occupation and people got to get used to renting, and we've got an undersupply of renting, so we need more renting supply. Well, actually, the renting supply has increased 191% since 1986, which is about the same time that the homelessness figures started to go up. So these things are not, you know, directly related. What's really happened is that owner occupation in New Zealand was the egalitarian pathway. Once you get rid of that, you put pressure on the rental system, and those that are absolutely dependent get pushed out. So there is actually a connection here with homelessness, because they can no longer find a place for themselves, can't get into owner occupation, and now they're in the rental system competing with people with many more resources than they have. And then the third thing is that we don't give enough attention to our stock. And we often do that because we think it will cost us more. So we don't have functional stock, and i.e. accessible, universal design and so forth. But we also don't have stock which is really resilient to climate change, or even just weather, actually, quite frankly. So on all fronts, we are really struggling at the moment. Well, I think we really need to focus, and we are increasingly focusing on investing in low-priced housing and increasing the production of it. And some of that's through the community sector. And so one of the things that always strikes me about the community sector is that actually it builds good houses in general, and it builds good houses because it's got skin in the game. They're going to own that house, or they're going to own that house if they're in a owner occupation, shared ownership relationship with people living there. As a landlord, they'll own it for probably the life of that house. And so their interests are not only housing people well, making people's lives better because people have a home, but also in building houses that are going to work over the long term. And one of the pressures on the community sector is to actually reduce the quality of their housing to try and reduce cost. And I would, in general, it could be said that the problem is not the quality of the housing, it's the cost, it's actually the price of the housing. And the community sector in general gets a jolly, they can get the pencil sharpened up pretty well. So I think they do really well. I think that we've done much better in thinking about how we can reintroduce some tools to get the private sector to work better, particularly the construction industry to work better. And that involves not necessarily funding them, but incentivising them, underwriting some of the costs, picking up things when risks have come into play, and being prepared to do that. So I think we're much braver now at investing. And so I think working better has happened on a number of fronts. I think both government investment, but also community sector investment. It's a much more sophisticated sector than it was 30 years ago. Well, the accommodation supplement is essentially what is known as a demand-driven benefit. So it's provided out of New Zealand Social Security Act. It's provided through MSD. And if your outgoings exceed a certain amount of your income, you may be eligible for the accommodation supplement. When it was introduced in the 1990s, the idea was that you would be able to get lots of choice because of the accommodation. It wasn't tied to a public house, for instance, or a state house as it was then. You could get accommodation supplement whether you were in rent or in owner occupation. But the reality is, we always knew that demand-driven benefits like this can get fiscally unmanageable, and that's what's happened here. And it has done so without actually paying the full unaffordable gap that individuals face in their housing, because there's a limit on how much accommodation supplement that you can access. And in fact, it is not supposed to be more than half of the unaffordable gap anyhow. So it's already saying, if you get the accommodation supplement, your housing will still be unaffordable, but we'll just give you a bit of a subsidy. So the choice was spread it thin and wide compared to solve people's housing affordability problem, narrow and deep, if you like. And the problem with it is, of course, it is now a very, very expensive item in the government ledgers. And it's also totally inadequate. So now we have temporary accommodation supplement payments for some people as well. So we, each year, I think last year, the amount budgeted for the accommodation supplement was $2.4 billion. Not all drawn down, but it's an awful lot of money every year, day in, year in, year out. Well, of course, I would immediately say you put it in the community housing sector to provide low-cost housing across different tenures. Rental, long-term affordable rent, intermediate tenures, shared ownership, cooperatives. Investment that actually leverages community housing resources, and for iwi, resources, leverage land and the resources that they have, leverage the resources of individuals so that you actually build a housing stock that works for people. And you can spread that thin. So if you look at Queenstown Lakes, I probably shouldn't mention a particular group, but Queenstown Lakes have, through their system, have been able to leverage $3 for every dollar put in by public agencies, either the council or central government. So $3 per dollar invested, it's a pretty good outcome. So that's the stock asset has increased. So the problem with the accommodation supplement, you can't just take it away, because people actually do need it in their incomes. It's just that it's not resolving the housing affordability problem. We sold off our mortgages in New Zealand. We had a very large portfolio. We sold them off, like all sorts of things. When you sell off stuff and then you think, oh, actually I quite like to use that, and you go to market to try and buy it back, it's actually quite expensive. So we have taken ourselves from being in a relatively well-positioned point in the 1980s to a very poorly positioned point in 2023, and have been there for a long time. 2013, when the housing crisis was being denied, it was clear that there was a housing crisis. So it's not straightforward and it's not cheap. But if we want to actually see housing, which it is, as infrastructure, we worry about our pipes and our drains and all that sort of stuff, but housing is infrastructure. You can't have a society without decent housing. you know, the issue is that, you know, the human body is a vulnerable thing. You know, it in general can't survive particularly well year in, year out, outside without shelter. And so it is such a basic thing. So it's as basic as food. If you're going to survive well, and if your community is going to survive well, you do need shelter. I'm often more interested now in moving from shelter to housing and from housing to home. What makes a home? Because it's the home that delivers attachment. And it delivers not only attachment between the people that live within it, but it also delivers attachment within communities. And so if you've got a whole lot of people who are in housing but do not have a sense of home and attachment to that community, it's a very different environment. It's a very different dynamic to actually having a home. So shelter is a human right, but so I think are homes. Well, I think they do, but also as the population ages, we've actually now got a very vulnerable or an increasingly vulnerable set of seniors as well. So that was something that you could have, in the 1970s or 80s, you would have said, oh no, they're all hunky-dory. But the changes that happened during the 1990s, the decline in owner occupation means that seniors will not be good in the future. That actually has major implications for young people as well. Firstly, you get this whole sort of thing, oh, you know, seniors got a good suck of the sav and we didn't, so you get a lot of intergenerational conflict, which surrounds housing, because some people look as though they were allowed through the gate and then the gate was closed on others. And actually that's sort of true. Not entirely true, but it's sort of true. But it wasn't the individual's fault. It's not a, you know, someone like me saying, oh no, I'm not going to let them through the gate. It was you know, these were big political decisions. It's been particularly true for Māori and Pacific because of the different ages of their population, so they've been really hard done by it. But the most important thing is that in a way it doesn't matter what the tenure is, in principle. I'll come back to the specifics in a minute, in principle, but all children need secure environments in which they can thrive. In some, even if they have got secure environments in the sense of that they're in home ownership or it's affordable, whatever, but if they're exposed to abuse or violence, domestic violence, there needs to be a mechanism by which they and whoever is a victim of that can either get out or get the perpetrator of that out. Those things have sort of fallen by the wayside, and it's very interesting to me now looking at the expansion of what is called emergency housing. When I was a young housing officer, emergency housing was essentially the women's refuge. That's what it was. Or when there was a fire, someone's lost their house, they could get an emergency benefit to get into housing. That's what it is. Not that now. And that shows a failure of the housing system. So what is the situation that people are in emergency housing? They're not really in emergency housing. They have had long-term unmet housing need and are in such precarious situations. Something has to be done. That's quite different from having an unexpected event or an event that no longer means that someone has secure housing. That's an emergency. So for kids, secure housing is really, really, really important. Well, you know, everyone has a place within the housing system. Private landlords have a place. Interesting for private landlords is that it broadly can be split into two. One, you have a small number of what I would call service landlords. They're in a service industry, they're delivering a product, they want that product to be good. And then you've got a whole lot of property investors who are just interested in the real estate. What is the difference between community housing and KO? I think the difference is, and the strength of community housing is that it can be anywhere within a community. KO tends not to be, for both historic reasons, but also because of the way in which economies of scale work. You know, it tends to cluster together groups of people, tends to be in large cities, etc., etc. There is some stuff going around, but community housing is always not just part of the community, but an active player within the community, and they can provide not only friendly landlord services, but a diversity of housing products, from ownership and shared ownership right through to affordable rent, right through to supported housing. That's something that is quite unique. Not every community housing organisation should do that, but the sector is a hugely diverse sector which can tailor itself to the immediate needs of its peoples and its places. I think there is some problems around clip the ticket. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And that's partly because the industry itself is quite fragile. And so people are trying to make windfall gains as developers and builders. I mean, developers are an interesting group anyhow, because, you know, what do developers really do? Builders do things, you can see that. Developers do some other stuff. But the main problem, I think, that for the industry is that it's trying to cover a whole range of risks that 40 years ago they didn't have to. So there wasn't, 40 years ago they would have been able to get access to bridging finance in a way that they can't now. The whole financial sector, as it is internationally, is quite tricky. It is very much directed to not so much a product but a price, and so what you do is that you end up getting the materials cost are not the same at all as the price that comes to market, and you'll always go to the price that you think you can. And one of the reasons why the building industry struggles on an up market as well as a down market, you'll often hear of building, you know, contractors going bankrupt, and you think, oh, but we've got a building boom. And one of the reasons that happens is that they overexpand. They expand too quickly because they're trying to, you know, get as much hay cut while they can. But it's also because people are bullish within the market. So they know what their build price is or cost is. They know their regulatory costs, their consenting costs, etc., etc. And then they look at and they know what margin they want, and they know what their financier wants to take off them, and they look at what they've got left and the price that they think they're going to get on this heated market, and they say, oh, I can bid the land up. And so land becomes more and more expensive. You often hear people saying, oh, it's the land price, that's the problem. It is often a problem in the sense it's the biggest item, but it's not the cause of the high price. It's a symptom of the high prices that people expect to get on the market because they will bid up that land price. So that's one of the problems that we have. We don't have a mechanism which is safe to finance development, and that's one of the big things that has happened over the last few years, is a commitment to start investing in supply again. Supply in itself, big numbers, won't necessarily bring prices down. They might over 30 or 40 years, but they're not going to immediately. Changes in global market and finance bring prices down, as we can see at the moment. But what we do need is mechanisms to finance low-cost housing production, not the upper quartile, not the highest 25 or 50%. And the only way that what used to be done in New Zealand is because people had access to not low interest rate money, but secure money, essentially. And the building industry had access to secure finance, which was safe and allowed them to deliver onto that low-cost housing market. I guess the question I always ask myself is, why do we keep saying we want stuff out of our housing system, but we're not prepared to make the moves to get it? I think partly it is because we forget our history. So people talk about the housing crisis as if it's a wicked problem, but it's not a wicked problem. We didn't have a housing crisis in 1988. We've created a housing crisis. And so if you forget that, then you're doomed to thinking it's irresolvable and you're just sort of playing around with the symptoms and trying to do it. So that's part of it. Part of it is because we used to have a very rich toolbox of things that we could manage the housing system with, both across the private sector, government and community sector, and government had a series of tools, and the housing reforms largely saw those tools thrown out. So we have an empty toolbox and it's not easy to get those back. And then the final thing is that I think people really misunderstand why people are in rental housing, or they certainly misunderstand why they're in people are in homelessness. There is a tendency to see that as someone's problem, their fault. Somehow they're inadequate. And I often have people say, well, you know, most people in homelessness have addiction problems or alcohol abuse problems. And I sort of say, well, hasn't the wastewater testing shown us where the big addiction problems or the big use problems of drugs are in New Zealand? And I don't think it's in the areas where there's a high degree of homelessness. And I also say, when I was a young housing officer, there were maybe 500 people were homeless. Another 5,000 mainly in rural areas and very, very, very poor housing that needed to be sorted out. And now we have around 41,000, and if you count the housing with poor amenity, 100-odd thousand. So that's in 30-odd years. That's not population change, and we haven't all become alcoholics and addicts over that problem to explain that expansion. So I think there's real misunderstanding and denial that around housing and housing need. It's a structural issue, it's about economic and political choices, and sometimes resolving those problems means that we also ourselves, who are sitting on our mound, our happy little mound, have to make some sacrifices for the greater good.